When I was 7 and already talking about how I wanted to write a book, my dad said I should start now and write a chapter every year of my life. I remember trying to start on the family computer, and at times by hand, and I gave it the title, A Young Life. I never got further than a few sentences in. At the time, the oldest and coolest age I could imagine being was 14, the age my sister Mariali was. 16, my sister Donita's age, was impossibly old and impossibly cool. I quickly abandoned the project and returned to writing weird fiction with no endings and the names of characters from the Babysitters Club and other books I was reading. A Young Life came to mind recently as a trip to Montreal last summer gave me a transformative and entirely unexpected present, letting go of guilt I didn't know I'd been holding on to about my relationship with my dad, who died when I was 19 and who I didn't make it home in time to see in hospital after he had a sudden stroke. He died, and I came home from VidCon 2011, the second one, and since then carried a guilt and all the obligations that come with loss, the death admin, the confusion, so much more, all of which obstructed my grief. The release from all of this has welcomed in new memories, things that float down the river Styx into my mind, and while I have always associated the family computer on which I first made my YouTube account on 4th of February 2006 with my dad, who loved Apple Macs before it was cool and who worked in computer systems management when freelancing and contracting with Rogue, it's only recently that I've been thinking in any detail about about what I was writing on that computer in the early days, what I was making, beyond pages using coding I learnt from Lisa Explains, and what I was seeking. I've talked about my diaries on YouTube a lot. The first one I have is from that year when I was 7, and I have so many videos on Unlisted and on literal CDs. I burnt them at one point when I was worried about losing them all. But it didn't occur to me until recently that I had, in fact, written A Young Life. It just didn't look like the kind of books I talk about on here. It was written in diaries, in mixes of lies and truths and performative crushes and things that pissed me off, and in fan fiction about the stories I wanted to fall into. It was also written in videos that began with the Logitech camera Mariali left behind when she went to university so we could Skype with her and my eldest sister who was living in Australia at the time. What were these videos about at first? Books? Stress, exams, TV shows, strong opinions, being part of the conversations in the fandoms I loved, a place of release and expression for a 14-year-old girl preoccupied to the point of starvation with the idea of perfection as something accomplishable. These videos were not polished or perfect or anywhere near as good as community channels or I Fancy the Trios, and I couldn't even imagine having a setup like Cute with Chris's because at first I couldn't ever imagine saying out loud that I made videos on YouTube, let alone that people would understand what that was or why. The biggest YouTubers had 2,000 subscribers. No one made money. We all had little awards on our pages. The website went down on Wednesdays when they did technical fixes, and my parents and sisters had no idea I was making them. 2006 went, and with 2007, the author of one of my favourite books started a YouTube channel with his brother. I went to YouTube gatherings in Leicester Square I didn't tell my parents about, a bit of a theme in these years, and met Jazza, then rhyming with oranges, was too nervous to say hi to Paper Lilies, swapped MSN Messenger usernames with a YouTuber who had launched her channel in spring, and was by summer one of the biggest YouTubers on the website and number 1 in the UK. That summer, I turned 16. YouTube, now owned by Google, added new features, my online fandoms collided, and friends were made through MySpace messages and familiar usernames. I talked about books I got out of the library and my GCSE results and what I got for my birthday. No one made money on YouTube, and the goal for many was to hit the front page. The UK front page was run by a guy called Jamie, I think. I tried out so many different kinds of video. I tried to want to get the kind of YouTube success my new friends were getting, but found I didn't really want it. I wanted my chaos and my friends to try new things, to get better at editing, and maybe learn to clone myself like Natalie Tran, because I'd also discovered that my computer had iMovie sometime in 2007. By this point, I had a job working in the children's bookshop I grew up going to. 5 days a week I had school, going into sixth form, the last 2 years of sixth form, working every part of me to get into Oxford, the dream. I made YouTube videos when my parents were out. I went to Camden and house parties and bought Enemy every week. On Saturdays and Sundays, I worked for £3.53 an hour at the bookshop. On weekday evenings, I babysat when I could. I stayed up until 2 a.m. studying. I read books. I watched YouTube. I wrote in my diary a lot. I wrote stories sometimes. I talked to the person I was dating, the YouTuber I had swapped MSN usernames with, on the phone. She came to visit one weekend and our parents met, but I had to go back to work, and it was a Sunday. She and her family were only here for the day. When I got home, my dad said, and I remember it gutturally, I've got a bone to pick with you. The absolute dread of it. And then he said the words I was somehow not expecting, except in retrospect, how obvious. I hear you've been making videos on YouTube. There was tension for a while, and I was even more careful about what I said. For the first time, I was truly cognizant of the crossover between internet life and IRL. In the coming years, as my friends at school would talk to me about YouTube, and my form tutor asked me whether I thought he should start a film YouTube channel, and as horrible things happened too, I broke up that first teenage relationship and strangers sent me hate comments for a year. Someone followed me home from work. People abused their fame, and I didn't have all the words for why it was wrong, but felt that wrongness deeply. Later I found the words, and that was as hard in a way. The partner program began, and money became part of it all, and new anxieties came in. Was I supposed to want to be rich from this? And the messiness of YouTube suddenly felt covered in cling film, like a sheen. There was panic and fear, and I was also somewhere in the bridge of 17, 18, unrequited and too requited crushes, broken-hearted by an Oxford rejection, never eating and getting away with it, crying in my form tutor and Spanish teacher's offices. Things that had once felt so easy to talk about on YouTube, life things that had once felt for YouTube, suddenly were risky to share because more people were watching and in different ways. The UK and Irish YouTubers, once a relatively small crew, grew and changed. But I still found my people. Lex and I became friends when they messaged me on Blog TV during John's live shows. They said they knew a friend of mine at school, and I thought they were being weird, but it turns out there was in fact a friend in common, and bit by bit we got to know each other. Kaylee came and stayed with me in the summer of 2008 before we both flew to Chicago, a trip I had saved up for ages, to go to a convention. That was the first time I met so many of my US internet friends in real life, including John and Hank, who did a Paper Towns event in the Harold Washington Library nearby, and 4 out of 5 were the 5 awesome girls, and my OG YouTube inspiration and now close friend, Brie of I Fancy the Trio. What else to say about this time? So much. I finished secondary school and went to the University of Exeter, vlogging from my room in secret, unsure if I wanted my new friends to know about my life online. I had a really hard time there, exposed to the power dynamics and classism and racism at a different scale, casual comments thrown in conversation with the assumption we'd agree, kids who'd all met at boarding school, people I'd come to like, and then see photos of in blackface at sports socials with no one batting an eyelid. There were things I couldn't talk about in videos and the feeling I'd fucked up. The lecturer who started the week on feminist literature I'd been looking forward to by reading the lyrics to Have You Ever Really Loved a Woman? I look back on this time and understand more than I did then about the crisis I was experiencing. Everything I had worked for, not eaten for, been the picture of the good girl for, felt like a joke, and that it didn't matter. In a way, it was the harsh awakening I needed. In others, I couldn't let go of the performance. Or, more likely, it was too painful to accept that everything else was wrong, or the goal had been an illusion, and easier to accept that I was wrong. I ate less. When I did eat, I was sick. I'd go out 4 times a week with the other freshers and sit under the counter in halls crying at 3 a.m, writing diary entries drunk and sad and terribly lonely. I made videos too, talking about how I felt. I didn't upload them. This was also part of the book I was writing without knowing then. Grainy, filmed on my laptop camera as most of my videos still were. Lost, trying to find control. My YouTube friends felt far away again, in many ways, and so did YouTube. In 2009, it was moving towards something I recognised far more in glamour magazines than my life, something shinier, with more polish, more focus on things like beauty and fashion and film that had always made me feel a bit like an outsider. When I joined YouTube, it was the era of blogger girls. We all had live journals and read blogs about street fashion and coveted the fruits books that were in Forbidden Planet and out of our price range. Or I did, at least, because I read music blogs, and I couldn't wait for a day when I'd have an NME column of my own and be backstage at parties with Brandon Flowers. And then, for want of a better word, YouTube floated towards the mainstream. YouTubers who now would consider themselves in the early days joined. In 2010, I did a year abroad at Vassar College, and with a new digital camera in hand, I was excited to film videos out and about. There was so much I loved about Vassar. Academically, it was a much better fit for me. Smaller, challenging, fascinating 300-level seminars on urbanism and literature, led by now Pulitzer Prize-winning Wasu, a class I loved called Modernism at Night, Tyrone Simpson's critical race theory, which was central to so much of what came after, what I read, how I thought, how I challenged myself. It was also a great place to begin to make videos while I travelled. My little experiment in series, Sorry Can't Drive, in no small part a response to thoughts from places. I met up with internet friends around the US, got stranded in New York when I was trying to get home for Christmas, eventually made it home and felt out of place in new ways, filmed it all in small ways, back to Vassar, back to feeling like something of the direction of my life was an illusion. I drink a lot and make messes of things. Food was chaotic. I saw the university counsellor, the second I'd seen after one in my first year at Exeter, and this guy sweet and warm, where the woman there had been cold and harsh. Both made me feel deeply uncomfortable in different ways. I had YouTube as my confessional place, but 5 years in, and it wasn't serving its purpose. Sometimes I would make videos talking more directly to my feelings, but mostly I kept the painful honesty of my eating disorder and depression, because I knew now that's what it was, to Skype chats and tweets I can't believe I wrote. There it felt neutral for a time, until a friend I trusted said they felt like they were enabling me by following me on these sites. They said my posts upset our mutual friends who had body issues. A girl I had friends in common with sent me a message asking why I only posted thin white women on Tumblr. Every one of the bedrooms I lived in and vlogged in to this point had magazine cutouts of models all over the walls. There was so much I couldn't say, and even further I was being made aware that I was doing harm to people in the few spaces that I felt like I could be honest in. With this and with the other abuses of power in my life at the time, I felt so lost, alone, and sad. I used to walk around the Mexican supermarket in Poughkeepsie, or the woods behind the lake at Vassar, wanting this feeling to go away. I was lost on YouTube, lost in life, 19 years old. I went home for a couple of months at the end of term, worked solidly, flew to California for the second VidCon. I hadn't been able to make it to the first. I stayed with my friends Arb and Tyler, at this point, the internet before internet friends had fallen off. I woke up in Arb's flat in LA to a phone call from my sister Donita saying my dad had had a stroke. A couple of days later, he was dead. There were 5 of us sharing a hotel room, and I couldn't bear the thought of being there. This was at the Hyatt Century City. So I went with a few of my friends to the District Lines party. I was barely there 20 minutes before John arrived, took the glass out of my hand, and found me somewhere quiet to cry and rest. He left me with some reading, the book he had finished and was making comments on, lots of stat to his copy editors. This was July 29th, 2011. I was there for one more night, I think, maybe 2, terrified to not be around friends, these friends who remedied the deep isolation I felt, who I'd met because I uploaded videos on the internet. Already on a new planet, I remember dancing to the Gregory Brothers to their new song, I Love Cats, and the late great Yosemite Bear coming on stage for Double Rainbow. I went home, still 19, into a new life of death admin, and God, I don't even know the words for what else. I wanted to tell YouTube though. Still tanned and with box-dyed blonde hair, I made a video telling everyone who subscribed to my channel that my dad had died. The love I received from everyone, including some of you watching this, was a hug from friends in a time of deep isolation. Suddenly, in this experience of grief, I could be honest on YouTube again. To a point. I could talk about some of it, show some of it. I remember a comment I got when I showed the yellow dress I wore to my dad's funeral, questioning why I would wear that colour. The feeling, fuck you, my dad's dead, came easily. I went back to Exeter for my final year. I sought support from the school and received very little, except from the GP who put me on my first antidepressants and my dissertation supervisor, who only found out towards the end of me writing about American literature since 9/11 and Abu Ghraib that my dad was dead and suggested I could have picked a softer topic. I filmed bits of my life. Lex visited me at Exeter and dyed my hair. At one point I met Sana at a YouTube party where she had unlimited drinks, so kept getting me free gin and tonics. I graduated. My dad was dead. At some point before that, I remember the guy I had a huge crush on coming up to me in a club and calling me blogger. The secret was out. But this was 2011, and people didn't really know that blogging and vlogging were 2 different things. When I had my camera out in public, at best I got weird looks. At worst, security asked me to stop filming, even if I was only filming myself. I felt things changed when vlogging at home too. By this point, I was living with 3 friends I had made online in an ex-council flat in Homerton. My ex was the guarantor because their parents weren't residents and my dad was dead. I worked at Top Man Oxford Circus and made £7 an hour. I would go out to clubs with colleagues several nights of the week and made videos about books, applying to jobs in publishing, and also simultaneously pitching digital, social, new media roles. I don't know when BookTube got its name, but it was around this time, and again, oddly, from not starting YouTube at the time of Verticals, but long before, I felt outside of it. American booktubers were getting brand deals and were friends with each other. I was in meetings trying to tell people YouTube and Twitter and Tumblr were important to reach readers. A few people listened. On days, mornings off from Top Man, I gave talks to agencies like Hill & Knowlton about digital media, which was a welcome £150. I took a week off work to do a work experience at Penguin. I was worn out and miserable and deeply eating disordered when John offered me a couple of weeks of admin work. I had just quit Top Man because I felt I couldn't do it with my mental health the way it was. After the first week, John told me to stop looking for work, that he had a role for me. It was then that I became his remote assistant, a term a lot of people found bizarre. Most of our conversations and much of our work to do in those early days happened through Skype. And God, my 20s, what a time. Hard to look back at, hard to navigate. I was so sad and struggling and trying to find the ground. I was also in many ways thinking, feeling good at my work, excited to use all this knowledge of all this niche. I did a brand deal for a book and then another. They weren't called brand deals then, but I can't remember what they were called. I gave talks at major book conferences about digital media and was there for the shift from calling it new media to online media to, much later, the horrible word, content. All through this, however much my upload frequency ebbed and flowed, I was a YouTuber. I went to more therapists. I won a camera from YouTube Next Vlogger alongside little-known video makers Dan and Phil. Everything was about HD, DSLR, filmmaking. Whatever happened to making things for fun using our desktop cameras? At some point, YouTube did an update, and many of my early direct capture uploads lost their sound. It sounds like I resented it, but I don't think that's entirely it. Again, I felt lost, and like something I did for fun suddenly had so much pressure attached to it. And there was a new current of mocking from newer creators too, who were cutting about how some people edited or did or didn't use music, how they titled videos or used thumbnails. Celebrity culture and YouTube began to merge. I was at 2014 VidCon when people knocked me over trying to get to John. I met Anna Kendrick once. Already sensitive about how I looked on camera, I hated that one of the antidepressants I had been put on made me gain a lot of weight, and it was mentioned in the comments and on forums. I stopped taking it, I moved to the USA for work and became a producing partner. YouTube became ever shinier. I was lonely, and without antidepressants and therapy I struggled, so with help from friends I started both again. The week I started taking paroxetine was a miracle. Everything felt possible again. I think this was the year that I started making back burner videos and was awarded a grant from YouTube Creators for Change. I went with UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, to visit communities of internally displaced people in Colombia, following a trip John and I had taken with UNHCR to Jordan to meet people living in Zaatari and Azraq camps. Both trips were key to my life. I look back at the videos I made, and there is so much I wish I had done differently or thought more carefully about, but also, God, I learnt so much from the people I met. I moved home to London in 2018. I found a therapist in London. I still see her now. I made fewer and fewer videos for time, but also dysmorphia. I lived with Lex for a couple of months and then found the flat I live in now and lived in with Sana. I connected to new internet friends and old. Some I'd become closer with while I was away, others who had been young when I first met them, but after 3 years of living in Indiana, were now in their mid-20s, living in London, up for coffee and hangs. I got in the groove of life here again and enjoyed going to book events, although I had learnt to some degree how little I enjoyed most book brand deals, particularly if I had no real connection to the books. Many years later, I'd think, I just have no interest in being an ad. That's not why I make videos. For me, that treats this too cheaply. Full-time YouTuber life wasn't for me, but again I felt like I was amidst an effort to prove it was. I don't know. I worry about hurting people's feelings. This isn't a treatise about YouTube or YouTubers. This is a personal essay about my YouTube. And then a slow collapse into 2019. In 2019, I was very ill again. When I moved back to the UK, despite mostly having enough medicine to cover me for a few months, I stopped taking it on my own, which is always dangerous, but with paroxetine especially dangerous because of elevated risk of suicidal thoughts, even among other similar drugs. So I was very depressed for ages, had many other personal life things I was simultaneously facing, was more immediately alongside other YouTubers who were doing it full-time and uploading consistently with strategies and sometimes even agents, and who seemed to be able to do this in a way that was impossible to me. Some of that was depression and the dysmorphia, and the fact I was hungry all the time. Some of it wasn't. It was so noisy then, and I was so tired. I had a catastrophic New Year's 2020. In January, my support people helped me get back on antidepressants. I ate a little more regularly. Stitch by stitch, I mended some things, walked away from others. And one day I was feeling so much better. It was early March 2020. You know what happened next, and some of it you don't. But like when my dad died, when the pandemic was declared, suddenly I felt more confident and able to share how I was actually doing. And in a way, it was like so much of what people were experiencing en masse, trapped in houses by something they can't see, rang true for me and my depression and dysmorphia. Sana and I got through the first lockdown, and then she moved out, but not far away. Summer 2020 was epic, and then again, catastrophic, when I understood there was even more I had to walk away from. Second and third lockdowns were an abyss. These are the times in my life I have kept the fewest diary entries, probably made the fewest videos. So many people said, keep a diary, show your grandchildren. There were days I didn't want to get to the end of. I got a puppy and let him bite and scratch me to outsource the pain, then posted sweet pictures of us on Instagram. I gave the puppy back after a week. I hated myself. Making YouTube videos got harder and harder, especially as some of my most fraught friendships at the time were with people who shared elements of their lives online, and Instagram and YouTube videos felt like weapons in their arsenals, even though in retrospect I know much of the time they weren't thinking about me. But I've seen enough narcissism in the online world and outside to recognise it. For so long I wanted its acceptance. And then suddenly, or after a lot of work and care and compassion and release and love and so much more, I was okay. I remember the walks Lucy and I took along the canal or in the park when our lives were a mess. I think back to the other week in Mexico City, how different our lives and our challenges and our conversations are now, and how even though many of the same challenges remain, they wear different frames. Then later in 2021, I enrolled in a master's in migration, mobility and development at SOAS. I worked a lot. I thought about all the videos I wanted to make and made barely any of them. I thought about them every time I wrote an essay. Maybe I'd make the essay into a video, I thought. And then I didn't. I wrote my dissertation about the Darien Gap. My introduction was in part about my Creators for Change trip to Colombia. I loved doing my master's and all of the people I met doing it. As I told them once in late 2021 or early 2022 when they were over at my flat, part of the reason I did the master's was I was in need of new friends also who I could talk to about migration and all the injustices of mobility with. There were things I felt many people in the online world only cared to a point about, or to the point it affected them, or what their audience expected from them. I didn't need everyone to care about the migration narratives the way I did, but I did need more people in my life who talked about something other than a thumbnail. I got a distinction on my dissertation and my degree overall. Even before then, it was the university experience I had dreamed about all those years ago. I felt so much better. Lex and Lucy were the guests of my graduation a year later. We finally got to make Turtles All the Way Down. Hank had cancer and everything was terrifying. More life happened. I filmed so many videos and didn't upload them because years of taking and posting photos on my phone, mostly sharing to Instagram, had further warped my sense of my face. I went to see the Killers a lot, and along the way saw friends I hadn't seen since 2019 or before, as international travel restrictions had kept us apart. I made new friends through Killers shows who I kept up with at gigs or in group chats. I cried thinking about how scared I had been that we had lost live music. I went to Mexico for the first time in 6 years and returned the following January, and the January just gone. I filmed more. Maybe you'll see it one day. But today, 20 years on from the day I signed up for YouTube on the computer under the stairs, 14 years old, looking for connection, I recognise I don't always need to upload the video or finish the page to have written the book. Here it all is, mixed media, a young life. Thank you for watching.